Hey everyone, my name is Yashili, and today I will be presenting on the paper APICraft Fuzz Driver Generation for closed source SDK libraries, which was published at the Usenix Security Symposium in 2021. This paper focuses on improving how we test software libraries for vulnerabilities, especially when the libraries are closed source, meaning we cannot see their internal implementation. The key idea of the paper is a system called APICraft, which automatically generates fuzz drivers that allow fuzzing tools to test these libraries more effectively. In this presentation, I'll first explain the background concepts like fuzzing and fuzz drivers, then describe the APICraft system, and finally discuss the evaluation results and limitations of the approach. Software vulnerabilities remain one of the most common causes of security incidents today. Modern applications rely heavily on shared libraries provided by software development kits, or SDKs. These libraries handle tasks like processing images, rendering fonts, parsing PDFs, decoding audio files, and many other core functions. If a vulnerability exists inside one of these libraries, it can affect every application that uses that library. For example, if a vulnerability exists in a PDF processing library, it could potentially affect many programs that open PDF files. The challenge becomes even more difficult when these libraries are closed source. When the source code is not available, researchers and security engineers cannot easily analyze how the software works internally. This raises an important question. How can we effectively test software libraries when we cannot see their source code? That question is exactly what this paper tries to answer. One of the most effective techniques for discovering vulnerabilities is called fuzzing. Fuzzing is an automated testing technique where a tool generates many random or malformed inputs and feeds them into a program. The goal is to see whether the program crashes or behaves unexpectedly. If the program crashes, that often indicates a bug or a vulnerability. Modern fuzzers like AFL, libfuzzer, and hongfuzz have been extremely successful. According to the paper, fuzzing tools have discovered thousands of vulnerabilities in real-world software systems. The strength of fuzzing is that it can automatically test millions of inputs much faster than a human tester could. While fuzzing works very well for standalone applications, it becomes more difficult when dealing with libraries. Applications usually have a clear entry point, typically a main function, which the fuzzer can run directly. Libraries, however, are designed to be used by other programs. They do not have their own entry point that can simply be executed. This means a fuzzer cannot interact with a library directly. To fuzz a library, we need an additional program that calls the library's functions and passes inputs from the fuzzer into those functions. That program is known as a fuzz driver. A fuzz driver, sometimes called a fuzz harness, is a small program that connects the fuzzer to a library. The fuzz driver receives input from the fuzzer and then calls specific API functions from the library using that input. The purpose of the driver is to guide the fuzzer into executing meaningful parts of the library. However, writing a good fuzz driver is not trivial. The driver must call the correct functions in the correct order and pass appropriate data structures. If the driver is poorly written, the fuzzer might never reach deeper code inside the library. So the quality of fuzzing results often depends heavily on how well the fuzz driver is written. Traditionally, fuzz drivers are written manually by security experts. This process can be very time consuming because the developer must understand how the library's APIs work. Many SDK libraries contain hundreds of functions with complex relationships between them. For example, one function might create an object that must be passed into another function later. If the driver calls functions incorrectly, the program may fail immediately instead of executing deeper logic where vulnerabilities might exist. Because of these difficulties, manually writing fuzz drivers require both experience and significant effort. Existing research tools have tried to automatically generate fuzz drivers, but most of them rely on analyzing source code. They examine how existing programs use a library and then attempt to synthesize new drivers based on the information. However, this approach does not work well for closed source SDKs. because the source code is unavailable. Additionally, the programs that use the SDK may also be closed source, making static analysis even more difficult. The authors of the paper identify two major challenges. First, there is a limited information available about how the library works internally. Second, the relationships between API functions can be complex, and correct function sequences must be preserved. The main idea behind APICraft is to learn how a library works by observing how real applications use it during execution. Instead of analyzing source code, APICraft records execution traces of applications that interact with the target SDK. These traces contain valuable information about which functions are called, in what order they are called, and how data flows between them. But analyzing this runtime information, APICraft can infer valid sequences of API calls. It then uses this information to automatically generate fuzz drivers. This approach allows the system to work even when the library and its consumer programs are closed source. To understand the problem, let's look at how the APICraft system works overall. At a high level, APICraft follows a pipeline with several stages. The process starts with pre-processing, where the system gathers information about the SDK and the programs that use it. Next comes dependency collection, where APICraft analyzes how different API functions interact with each other. In particular, it tries to identify relationships between functions. For example, when the output of one function becomes the input of another. After collecting this information, the system moves to driver generation. In this stage, APICraft combines the discovered relationships between API functions to create candidate fuzz drivers. The important point here is that the entire workflow is fully automated. Instead of requiring a security researcher to manually write drivers, APICraft can generate them automatically by learning from how real programs use the SDK. The first major step in APICraft is the collect stage. In this stage, the system analyzes execution traces from programs that use the target SDK. These traces record which API functions are called during execution and what data flows between them. APICraft looks for something called data dependencies. A data dependency occurs when one function produces a value that another function later uses as input. For example, imagine a function that loads a font file and returns a font object. Another function might then take the font object as input to render text. That relationship represents a dependency between those two functions. APICraft also analyzes control relationships, which include things like error handling checks. These checks help the system understand when a function call is considered successful or when it should stop executing. By identifying these dependencies, the system can reconstruct how the API functions are typically used together. Once the dependencies between functions are collected, APICraft moves to the combine stage. In this stage, the system tries to combine the collected dependencies into complete fuzz drivers. The challenge here is that there may be many possible combinations of API calls. Trying every possible sequence of API calls would be computationally infeasible, especially in large SDKs with hundreds of functions. To solve this problem, APICraft uses a genetic algorithm to guide the search. A genetic algorithm is inspired by biological evolution. The system starts with many candidate drivers, evaluates how well they perform, and then repeatedly improves them through processes similar to mutation and selection. Over time, the algorithm gradually evolves better and better fuzz drivers. This approach allows APICraft to efficiently explore the huge space of possible API call sequences. When evaluating candidate fuzz drivers, APICraft tries to optimize three important goals. The first goal is diversity. Diversity means that the fuzz driver should use a wide range of API functions. The more functions we call, the more parts of the library we can potentially test. The second goal is effectiveness. Effectiveness refers to how well the driver triggers deeper execution paths within the library. Ideally, we want the driver to reach complex internal logic rather than just shallow checks. The third goal is compactness. A driver should avoid unnecessary or redundant function calls. If the driver includes too many irrelevant calls, it may become inefficient or harder for the fuzzer to explore effectively. By balancing these three objectives, diversity, effectiveness, and compactness, APICraft can generate fuzz drivers that explore the library thoroughly while remaining efficient. To illustrate how APICraft works, the paper provides an example involving a font rendering library. In this scenario, several different API functions interact with each other to process fonts. For example, one function might create a font descriptor, another might extract a font object from that descriptor, and another function might perform operations like calculating spacing or rendering characters. These functions must be called in the correct order, and the output of one function may need to be passed into another. If we tried to manually discover all useful combinations of these functions, it would be extremely difficult and time-consuming. However, APICraft can automatically identify these relationships and generate multiple valid sequences of API calls that exercise different behaviors within the library. This allows fuzzing tools to explore a much larger portion of the library's functionality. Now that we understand how APICraft works, the next question is how well does it actually perform in practice? To answer this question, the authors evaluated the system using several attack surfaces within the Mac OS SDK. An attack surface refers to a component that processes input and could potentially be exploited if it contains a vulnerability. The authors selected multiple types of SDK libraries to test their approach. These included libraries that handle images, fonts, PDF files, audio processing, and rich text formats. These libraries are widely used by many applications and therefore represent realistic targets for security testing. To evaluate the effectiveness of APICraft, the authors compared the fuzz drivers generated by APICraft with the manually written fuzz drivers created by security experts. Both sets of drivers were then used with fuzzing tools to test the libraries over extended periods of time. The researchers measured several metrics during these experiments, including code coverage, which measures how much of the program's code was executed during testing, and the number of crashes discovered during fuzzing. These metrics help determine whether APICraft generated drivers are effective at exploring the internal logic of the libraries. The results of the experiments show that APICraft performs very well compared to manually written drivers. One of the most important findings is that APICraft generated drivers achieve significantly higher code coverage. On average, the generated drivers were able to reach about 64% more basic blocks of code than the manual drivers. This is an important improvement because in fuzz testing, higher coverage generally means a greater chance of finding bugs. If the fuzz driver only executes a small portion of the library, then many vulnerabilities may remain hidden. However, if the driver reaches deeper and more complex parts of the code, the fuzzer has a better chance of triggering unexpected behaviors. The experiments also show that APICraft generated drivers were able to discover more unique crashes compared to manually written drivers. Each crash represents a potential bug or vulnerability that needs further investigation. This suggests that automatically generated drivers can sometimes outperform human written drivers in terms of exploring the program's behavior. One of the most impressive parts of the paper is the real-world impact of the approach. The authors conducted a long-term fuzzing campaign using the drivers generated by APICraft. During this campaign, they discovered 142 previously unknown vulnerabilities in Mac OS SDK libraries. Out of these vulnerabilities, 54 were assigned official CVE identifiers, which means they were recognized as legitimate security issues and documented in the public vulnerability database. Some of these vulnerabilities affected widely used applications such as Safari and Preview, which are core applications in the Mac OS ecosystem. This shows that the vulnerabilities were not just theoretical problems but real issues that could potentially affect many users. These results demonstrate that automated fuzz driver generation can have a meaningful impact on improving software security. There are several important strengths of the APICraft approach. First, the system works without requiring access to source code. This is extremely valuable because many real-world SDKs are proprietary and closed source. Second, the approach is fully automated, which significantly reduces the manual effort required from security researchers. Writing high-quality fuzz drivers manually can take a long time and requires detailed knowledge of the API. Automating this process makes fuzz testing more scalable. Third, the system can handle complex SDK environments with many API functions and complicated dependencies between them. Finally, the evaluation demonstrates that the system can find real vulnerabilities in widely used software, which shows that the approach is practical and effective. Despite these strengths, the APICraft approach also has several limitations. One limitation is that the system relies on execution traces from existing applications. This means that APICraft learns how to use the library by observing how real programs interact with it. However, if the traced applications do not exercise certain API functions, those functions may never appear in the collected traces. As a result, the generated fuzz drivers might not include those functions, and certain parts of the library could remain untested. Another limitation is that the pre-processing and analysis steps required by APICraft can be computationally expensive. Collecting and analyzing execution traces, identifying dependencies, and running the genetic algorithm search all require significant processing time. Finally, implementing a system like APICraft is technically complex and may require adaptation for different SDK ecosystems. These limitations suggest that while the approach is promising, there is still room for improvement in future research. To conclude, this paper presents APICraft, a system that automatically generates fuzz drivers for closed-source SDK libraries. By analyzing execution traces from real applications and using search-based optimization techniques, APICraft can generate effective fuzz drivers without requiring access to the library's source code. The evaluation results show that this approach improves code coverage, discovers more crashes, and helps identify real vulnerabilities in widely used software. Overall, the work demonstrates that automated fuzz driver generation is a powerful technique for improving the security testing of proprietary software components. Thank you for listening.